What's happening, everybody? Welcome into episode 47 of the Two Stripes podcast. Colton Denning here out in Boulder, Colorado, a very snowy and cold Boulder, Colorado. Hope it is a lot warmer and nicer wherever you are than it is here. But nonetheless, welcome into today's show. Should be a fun one. And before I kick off today's show, have some business to attend to and want to thank everybody for listening to the last episode of the show about the Nebraska Cornhuskers and Scott Frost's first season on the job upcoming this year. It was the most downloaded show in Two Stripes podcast history. That may not mean a lot to anybody else, but it means a lot to me and everybody who listened. Thank you very much, and I hope that you all have stuck on to the show and continue listening as I keep doing these episodes in the off season and we make that slow march to the 2018 college football season. Big shout out to Evan Wiebe, who I interviewed at Corn Nation, for posting that up on the Corn Nation site. So that was pretty cool, and hopefully everybody who listened stuck around and can enjoy future episodes of the show, which you can do so by going to soundcloud.com/twostripespod, subscribing on Apple by searching the Two Stripes podcast, and you can also find it on YouTube. I usually upload these episodes a couple days after I upload them here to SoundCloud and onto Apple Podcasts. If you just search my name, Colton Denning, it should be the first thing that pops up. You can find all the old episodes of the show there. You can also find a bunch of college football videos, mostly Ohio State stuff, that I've cut up on YouTube. But if you like college football, there's some good stuff there as well. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Dubsco. With all that out of the way, let's get into today's show. And I'm going to continue the theme of first-year head coaches on today's episode because the other day I spoke with the owner of OnlyGators.com, Adam Silverstein, about Florida and Dan Mullen. Mullen was hired back in November as Florida's season was coming to an end and the Jim McElwain era kind of crumbled, but Adam and I had a pretty fun discussion about how Mullen's going to do in his first year, whether or not he has what it takes to handle the pressure of coaching in Gainesville, some of the differences between him and Jim McElwain, and what they're going to do offensively, because that's been the big thing with Florida since basically Urban Meyer left, is they haven't been able to field consistently good offenses, and that all kind of starts with the quarterback play, and it hasn't been there since Tim Tebow. So Mullen's going to have some interesting choices to make this offseason when it comes to that quarterback battle and the offense as a whole. We also spent some time talking about various other topics surrounding Florida football, including the recruiting class, signing day. The second signing day comes up here in less than a week, how Mullen did in some limited time putting together his 2018 recruiting class, and also talked about strength and conditioning, which was something that came up on the Nebraska episode. Mullen has gone out of his way to make that a priority, and talked about everything else pertaining to Florida football and some of the things that you should keep an eye out for this offseason when it comes to the Gators. You need to hear it from the man himself rather than hearing me talk about it, though. So let's get into it. Here is Adam Silverstein of OnlyGators.com. I am super excited to be joined by Adam Silverstein, the owner of OnlyGators.com. You can also find his work on CBS Sports. He is an assistant managing editor. You can find him covering college football, golf, combat sports, and the XFL. And you can also hear him on the In This Corner podcast on CBS with Brian Campbell, covering our greatest national pastime, professional wrestling. Adam, welcome to the show. How you doing, man?
Thanks. I like how, I put the XFL in the Twitter bio as a joke, but I'm glad that you included it in there. I mean, at this point, I guess I might as well be the XFL editor for CBS Sports at this point.
Hey, man, it's back. And before we get into this, real quickly, what do you think about the XFL being back?
So it's weird because when it initially came out in '99 and then debuted in 2001, it made a lot of sense. Like, it was, different. It fit a generation of fans, adolescents that really were into, what the type of product the XFL was providing. And now they're coming back in 2018. Obviously, you can't do what they did then, and they're trying to put forth a family-friendly, politics-free, league, and they're still 2 years away from even wanting to start it. I don't know. I mean, I think it worked then, and if they didn't make as many mistakes as they did, who knows? Maybe it would still be around today as a number 2 league. This one, yeah, I'm going to believe it when I see it at this point, I would say.
Yeah, and one of the things it seems like they really missed the mark on last time was not hiring guys like Rich Rodriguez and other, spread or offensive-minded coaches back in that era when it was only really popping up in Division III football or Division II or lower Division I football. And nowadays you can't really do that because NFL teams are running those schemes that guys like Rich Rodriguez and other offensive minds are. So we'll see how it shakes out. My biggest disappointment was I forget who it was. Somebody asked Vince McMahon whether he'd be ceasing day-to-day controls of WWE, and you could just tell that he was like, no, you're going to have to pry creative decisions from my cold, dead hands. And I was like, well, that settles that. But getting into today's episode, we're going to talk about the Florida Gators. And speaking of offensive minds, their new head coach, Dan Mullen, very offensive-minded, very different from their previous head coach, Jim McElwain, and Mullen hired in late November. And so far, what have been the biggest points of emphasis for Mullen about the program and what he wants going forward with Florida football?
Sure. Well, not so much of a difference in terms of how they were marketed to fans as being, Jim McElwain was marketed as a massive offensive mind. It just didn't really exactly turn out that way once he actually got to Gainesville. In terms of how things have already changed and how they will be changing, I think the biggest thing, and really Florida said it coming directly out with the hire and the introduction and the initial statement, is there's going to be an increased emphasis on the strength and conditioning program at the University of Florida. Now, listen, that's not necessarily to say that Jim McElwain didn't put an emphasis on that, but I think there was a noticeable difference what happened with the Gators players and their ability to keep up with the rest of the league and the rest of the country from a strength and conditioning standpoint after not just Urban Meyer left, but after Will Muschamp left. And really what has changed with the program over the last few years, they made it a point to say it in not just Dan Mullen's opening press conference, but in the release when they hired him, quotes from A.D. Scott Strickland and from Mullen about how important the strength and conditioning program would be for the Gators. And he went ahead and hired Nick Savage, who was his coordinator over at Mississippi State, brought him over to Florida for that very reason.
Yeah, I had that circled down here and because that's been such a point of contention amongst Florida fans and a real strong talking point about this hire. And you mentioned Nick Savage and A.D. Scott Strickland, who I believe was quoted as saying that Dan Mullen told him, like, we have to have this or we're really going to miss the mark if we don't hire Nick Savage. And teams have been going through their first initial workouts. And in the last episode, I talked about Nebraska, and we have seen them go through a similar phase with Scott Frost. And even today, it came out that 2 of their players had got rhabdo, and that was something we saw when Oregon made the transition to Willie Taggart as well. Have there been any early stories about how that initial transition has gone under Nick Savage?
Not stories just yet, but there have certainly been tweets from players, up at 5 a.m. I think Mullen said when he initially took over to the players that were, still on the roster that either didn't transfer or didn't graduate or go off to the NFL, get prepared for the toughest offseason of your entire lives. I am not exaggerating. Like it's going to be completely different from what you're used to. So, Florida had something that was called the Swamp Life program under Jim McElwain, and it was touted to be really special. And year one, the players did rave about it. Now, maybe they raved about it because it was super easy. I doubt any football offseason training program is quote unquote easy, but it does seem like there's a renewed focus and intensity for this strength program under Dan Mullen. And I'll tell you what, it's probably a welcome change for Florida because for all the changes that Mullen's going to bring, some of them, what Florida previously experienced under Urban Meyer, I think strength and conditioning is really where things start because there's really no reason for a program like Florida or Florida State, Miami, even UCF, USF, and FAU to not have top-notch athletes in the best physical condition they possibly can be.
One thing that stands out about the Florida job is that it is such a high-pressure environment. We saw it with Urban Meyer when he left and saw it to an extent with Jim McElwain. And from my outsider's view, it seems like Dan Mullen has the mentality to be able to thrive in that situation and deal with the pressure that comes with that. Because when you look at McElwain, there was times where he seemed so wound up his own ass. And, that's fine if you're Nick Saban or Urban Meyer, but McElwain never really seemed like a good enough coach to be able to do that. Like, it's a small thing, but the shark thing. And he could have just played it off as a joke, and it could have been spun into something that would have been funny and probably positive, but it wasn't. And Dan Mullen seems like the exact opposite of that, and like he's going to be able to handle some of the pressures and just some of the stories that come with being the head coach at the University of Florida.
So I didn't necessarily, I'll be honest, a lot of people did fault him for this. I didn't really fault McElwain for taking that shark thing seriously, because I think he felt it was like an affront to him, like his looks, his family, that anyone would even joke that a coach would do that. So personally, like, please no one do that. No, don't Photoshop a picture of me on a shark. But, but if it was me, I'd probably laugh it off because it obviously wasn't him. But I could see someone taking that rather seriously. The bigger problem is what you just mentioned about Jim McElwain, which was this guy thought he was the shit. I don't know if I can use that word on this podcast. And
no, you're free.
Okay, good. And he never really proved to be it at Florida. Just getting the Gators to win the SEC East in one of the formerly powerful division, but one of the most down divisions in college football over the last few years, only for them to get stomped by Florida State, Alabama, and Michigan twice each during his tenure. That doesn't necessarily mean you're a good, like, that you're a great coach or you're king shit or anything like that. You really need to do more than just beat Missouri and Kentucky and Vandy. And no offense to those programs. And by the way, I think one or two of them, definitely one of them, beat McElwain, over the course of his tenure at Florida. So I don't want to use, like, I don't like the phrase too big for his britches, but he definitely came in with an air about him, like, I am the reincarnation of Saban. I am someone who's going to take this program to new heights. He demanded a ton from Florida's athletic administration. Some of it that the Gators really did need to provide the football program, an indoor practice facility, revamped dorms. He did a lot of good in terms of off-the-field demands and forcing Florida to get up to trend now in 2017 and 2018. But on field, just because you win some of those smaller games, if you're getting blown out by Georgia and you're getting blown out by these other top quality schools that are actually competing for national titles, your program's it's not there. And I thought he believed that he had earned some type of, I don't even know the best word to put it, some type of superiority that he really had not actually earned during his time at Florida.
And one of those places that really became apparent was in recruiting, because the last few Florida classes, they haven't been bad by any means, but they seem to lack that traditional pop that you would expect from a Florida class. And you look at the 2018 class right now, they have 15 commits. They're 17th, ranked 17th in the nation by the 24/7 Sports Composite, 5th in the SEC. Does this one feel like it has any sort of difference with the McElwain classes? And how do you think they'll finish with the second signing day coming up just a week away?
Well, transitional classes are always difficult. I don't have the stat in front of me, but I do post about it relatively frequently on Twitter. My account's at Only Gators on there. And transitional classes are tough. I mean, you get classes ranked 21, 15, 17 when you're Florida. It's not necessarily a surprise, and it's very rare that a coach comes into even a program like Florida and just all of a sudden gets a number 9 overall class in a recruiting cycle when there's a major coaching change. So those haven't necessarily been a big deal. It wasn't a big deal coming from Meyer to Muschamp, from Muschamp to McElwain. And this year's class, if I'm a Florida fan, I'm not that worried about it. I think there's a lot of talent there. But you're right, McElwain really did not recruit up to snuff during his tenure with the Gators. What's interesting, and this happens often with coaches, is he was recruiting extremely well in 2018, and he looked headed for a possible top 6, top 7 class. And he had recruited Florida the number 1 class in 2019, absolutely loaded with players. Now, obviously, since this transition has come through, that 2019 class has been completely decimated. 2018, they lost a couple guys, but Dan Mullen did a great job coming in late and hanging on to most of them. I think he's going to close pretty strong. But when you're a team like Florida and you can't get a 5-star commit, you can't get a top 20, top 25, commit over however many years, that's a big problem. I think the only ones that McElwain actually got were guys Muschamp recruited that he just kind of, locked in with a couple weeks to go until that first signing day.
Even when Florida won back-to-back SEC East championships 2 2 and 3 years ago, and then this year it didn't really seem like they had an identity on either side of the ball. And one thing that stands out about Dan Mullen's teams at Mississippi State is they always had an identity. Offensively, it was that power run game. You saw quarterbacks like Chris Ralph, Dak Prescott, and Nick Fitzpatrick recently be able to run that type of system that he wanted. Even defensively, his best defenses, including last year's group, created a ton of havoc and were attacking units. Is that the ideal scenario or identity that he wants to bring and build at Florida?
Most likely, especially in the early going. Florida obviously wants electric offense. That's what the Gators are all about. And they definitely haven't had it for the last few years for myriad reasons, one of which is just pure offensive talent and play calling. But what the Gators do have coming back, they have some running backs. They have Michael Pirine. They got Malik Davis, extremely impressive true freshman this past year. They have Jordan Scarlett, who spent the last season suspended over those, credit card fraud charges where there were 8 players that all got caught up in it. It's Darius Lemons, he was also a true freshman who got some playing time. And they got some freshmen that are coming in too who are extremely talented. So in terms of running the ball, Florida's got it. And whether it's Emory Jones starting at quarterback or if they go back to Felipe Franks, both those guys have wheels. They're able to move the ball with their legs. So I do think that Dan Mullen is going to continue running that type of offense, especially in year one with the Gators. Now, if he winds up, really recruiting some top-tier receivers and things like that, I could see things opening up as we go. But this is a coach. Whenever anyone asks me about Dan Mullen, I kind of go back to a couple things. Number one, unlike Jim McElwain and unlike Will Muschamp, Florida's last 2 hires, this guy's been a head coach 9 years for in the SEC. And even Urban Meyer wasn't that, and certainly, Steve Spurrier wasn't that either, and neither was Ron Zook. But these guys were experienced head coaches. Urban had done it at multiple spots over a span of 4 or 5 years, maybe 6. Steve Spurrier was obviously an alumnus of the university. So you have a guy here who has coached national championship teams at Florida, went off, kind of sowed his royal oats in Mississippi State, and now he's coming back home to Florida, which is how the Gator fans feel about it. And he's coached 3 Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks over the course of his career. So, I'm sorry, 2 Heisman, is it 3 or 2? I'm forgetting about Dak. 2 Heisman Trophy winning quarterbacks, a guy who, who's done a great job in the NFL. So I think there's a lot of trust and belief in Mullen from an offensive perspective, where it's kind of, from Florida fans, we don't really care what kind of offense he runs, they would say. We just want him to score points. And we would like to get a game with 35 points on the scoreboard against a decent defensive team, which we haven't seen in, 3 or 4 years. I think that's how Florida fans are thinking right now.
Yeah, Mullen even had some time with Cam Newton when he was at Florida for that short stint. And you mentioned earlier the running backs and having kind of a stable of guys to pick from and see who comes out of spring ball and emerges as that top 2, top 3 guys in the offense. But wide receiver is a position to me that's really kind of stood out as an enigma for Florida, because when you look at the last few years, there have been players like Antonio Callaway or Brandon Powell, and on this year's team, Tyree Cleveland, who have these really huge moments where it looks like, man, this kid could be a first-round pick. This is a real player, and for whatever reason, it just hasn't really translated. What's their outlook for wide receiver? Is Cleveland going to be that guy that's expected to step up and take that next step, and who are some of the guys behind him that are going to be able to need to make plays for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for all the criticism that Jim McElwain gets, he tried extremely hard to recruit some top-tier wide receivers to Florida and had a lot of bad luck. Sometimes you just have bad luck. It happened to Urban Meyer late in his tenure at Florida with some of the guys he recruited, and it definitely happened to McElwain. So you had, obviously, Antonio Callaway. He was supposed to be a junior #1 receiver this year, extremely talented guy, never played. You had Josh Hammond and Freddie Swain, both 4-star recruits when McElwain brought him in, I think, in his 2nd recruiting class, if I remember correctly. Neither guy has really panned out. Tyree Cleveland's been great. Florida got him late in the recruiting cycle 2 years ago, or I guess technically 3 years ago now. I think took him away from TCU, if I remember correctly. And then the Gators go and take a risk. They put themselves on the line academically to get this kid James Robinson in out of Lakeland last year. And he has a heart issue, and he's going to have to retire from the game of football. Another 4-star guy. So, McElwain, again, he's recruited some dudes, and it's just unfortunate that they really haven't panned out. I think you're going to see a lot of Tyree Cleveland next year. If Dre Massey stays with the team, which I believe he's trying to get an additional year of eligibility, I think you're going to see a lot of him in the slot. And Florida just got verbal commitment from Justin Watkins. I think he's top 100 wide receiver out of Claremont, Florida. He's extremely talented. I would not be shocked to see him, play extensively or potentially start as a true freshman.
Trevon Grimes, a kid too, as an Ohio State fan that I was really excited about in transfers back to Florida trying to get that hardship waiver.
Right.
He's another guy that a lot of people haven't really seen, but if you follow recruiting a couple of years ago, he was a stud, and he came back off a torn ACL. He only played a little bit for Ohio State, but physically, if he's able to go and get that hardship waiver, you'd figure he'd be a major piece in that offense as well.
Oh, yeah, he's one of those top 3 starters if he's able to play right away and he's healthy and everything's good. But like I said, Florida does not have the depth of talent at the playmaking positions, even despite all the running backs I named earlier. They're very good, but they just don't have that electricity that the teams did under Urban Meyer when he was legitimately just any guy he wanted at Florida. I mean, he was able to get them either because they were an in-state kid or Florida was just rolling so hot that it was a no-brainer for these kids. I think the only guy he really missed out on that I can remember that was a true disappointment was like C.J. Spiller. And there was, there were some good reasons for that happening. One of them being Percy Harvin, and only so many footballs to go around, in a given game. So I think Mullen has some work to do from a recruiting standpoint. So far, so good. And his coaching staff seems to be aligned with, exactly what he wants. And it really helps considering he basically brought over his entire Mississippi State coaching staff with the exception of like 2 or 3 dudes.
And one of those guys who we're going to talk about right now is defensive coordinator Todd Grantham, and they'll be shifting to a 3-4 defense, and he's got some pieces to work with. Linebacker David Reese had a very productive season last year. CeCe Jefferson just announced that he is coming back after a very good year. He'll be back for his senior season. And then Marco Wilson had a really nice freshman season as a cornerback, had 10 passes broken up. How do all those players and the defensive pieces as a whole fit into what he wants to do?
Yeah, Jefferson coming back was massive, and, especially for the defensive front that did lose a number of guys to graduation and to the NFL draft. I think what a lot of people forget about Florida's defense is the Gators always recruited extremely strong. Coming from Urban Meyer and Charlie Strong recruiting that defense into Will Muschamp recruiting that defense. Dan Quinn, the Atlanta Falcons head coach, was Florida's defensive coordinator for a couple of years. Like, how lucky were the Gators, to have that. And they also had DJ Durkin for 1 year, fill into that position. So the Gators defensively forever have been amazing. And what ended up happening was Jim McElwain put such an emphasis on recruiting offense and did an okay job doing that Florida defensively has really been lacking. Now, that doesn't mean that the Gators don't have good defensive players. They do. You saw flashes this year from some of these young guys, especially towards the end of the year, but they're not the top-tier recruiting talent, the number 1 overall defensive tackle, the number 1 overall inside linebacker, those types of guys that Florida used to get, on a consistent basis that then they would coach up into being a top 5 most dominant defense in the country. I think this past year, Florida really had a linebacker problem. Not only were they thin and inexperienced to begin with, they had 2 guys who are going to be serious role players among those suspended for the entire season. So they're going to get those back. And there's some talent there. There's some 3-star, 4-star guys. But the Gators need to get back to recruiting linebacker, especially extremely strong. They're always going to have cornerbacks and safeties. That's rarely a problem. Defensive linemen, I personally believe you can recruit a lot of talent, but you can also develop a lot of talent. Linebackers are a very unique position. They're obviously the field generals of that side of the ball. And that's where Todd Grantham really needs to concentrate his focus, especially early on in his tenure at Florida.
Yeah, and it was such a shock to see their defense fall off the way it did. They finished 2017 54th in defensive S&P Plus after, I think, the year before finishing 4th. And even in the Muschamp years, those were dominant defensive teams. Is the expectation not to get back to that top 5 level, but, hey, have a top 20, top 25 defense next season, even under this new transition, because the pieces are there.
Yeah, you want to see a rebound. The pieces are there. I don't know that they're all there. I think for Florida in 2018, you want to see improvement. You want to see those young corners who really did legitimately impress. Marco Wilson, you mentioned him in particular. You want to see it just get better. You would like to see a top 40, top 35 defense that maybe is, but even better than that with some different coaching and some, just improved communication and things like that. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, the best Florida teams forever have had a top defense. And you saw what happened. Jim McElwain was kind of able to, I don't want to say coast along, but he was able to have a lot of success using Will Muschamp's defensive players and having a top 5, top 10, top 15 defense for those first couple of years. And then once those kids all graduated and left, and he was left with his underwhelming defensive recruits and underwhelming defensive schemes, you saw what happened to the Gators. So, and let's not also forget, Jim McElwain lost Florida after those Muschamp coaches and coordinators. They had Jeff Collins, who's now the head coach at Temple. So, then he lost him. He had to deal with Randy Shannon, who is now the UCF defensive coordinator. Some were not necessarily thrilled not be last year. And there's also some recruiting things that go in with Shannon and South Florida, so on and so forth. But I know we don't have an hour and a half to get into every single detail. Point being, I think Florida does need to have a dominant defense in order to be successful, but I think they have a year to kind of, to give Dan Mullen a little break and say, okay, get some more kids in here before you have to build it up.
I'm convinced that Randy Shannon is on a personal life mission to coach every single one of the Division I Florida schools before his time in coaching is up. But final question about Florida here. What are the two biggest storylines that you're looking ahead to as Florida transitions into spring ball and then the spring game on April 14th?
Well, that's a good question. The first one is the easy one, and I don't know that I'm going to have to think of another two while I of a second one while I answer your first one. The first one's obvious. It's been the question at quarterback for Florida since 2009. Do the Gators have a starting quarterback? And they still have not, even when Jeff Driscoll was behind center, and there was a reason to believe in him because the guy had a legitimate talent. Florida just couldn't figure out how to harness it. Do the Gators have a guy who can be good enough to start, 12 games, 13 games, and win a vast majority of them and set Florida on a course where they no longer have to worry about that position? Whether it's Emory Jones, maybe it's Felipe Franks actually being coached up, by Dan Mullen and his offensive staff. It remains to be seen at this point. But that is always the overriding question for Florida until Florida gets a guy who, basically makes it stop being a question. And the Gators have thought they've had that multiple times over the last 8 years, 9 years, but they just have not. Regarding the second question, I think it's tough. I think it's probably just, can Dan Mullen flip the switch in 12 months? Like when we talk if you and I talk a year from now, or when we look at this Florida team in 1 year, will his impact as a guy who was with this team during its heyday or its most recent heyday, is that really going to come to fruition? And was this the right hire for Scott Strickland and really his first big move as the Gators athletic director? If it works out, I think Gator fans will be happy. They can be patient. People talk about Florida's fan base being impatient or over demanding, but really it's not that much more different than top teams across the nation, Ohio State, Michigan, things like that. Is it more demanding than Florida State and maybe Miami? Sure. But the Gators have also won multiple national championships, this century, whereas some of those schools may have won 1 or 0 or, just aren't necessarily always expecting that same level of success. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, can Dan Mullen have a lot of success right away? And if he can, how will fans react to that, and how will recruits react to that as we get into the 2019 and 2020 classes? All
right, before I let you get out of here, this is the most important question that I have.
Sure.
What did you think about the Royal Rumble?
That's a good, that is, and for January 2018, with spring practice still a couple months away or a month away or so, that probably is more important. I thought it was good. It was one of their better events they've put on in a long time, pay-per-views as a whole and matches as a whole. We have to grade the matches here for CBS Sports. I graded it an A. I think start to finish, it was entertaining, and when you have a match that's going to last an hour and be that kind of convoluted as the Royal Rumble can be, that's the most important thing. Was it entertaining, and did you like the ending? And the answer to both of those was yes.
I think that's a good take. It was my favorite Royal Rumble of all time. Shinsuke is my favorite. Shinsuke is my favorite wrestler of all time. So I was watching that thing when his music hit, like it was overtime hockey. From 14 on, I was going crazy. So I really liked it. And the women's Royal Rumble was good. I was disappointed that Brie didn't get her ultimate revenge on Nikki, but overall, I'm pretty pumped about it.
I did think it would have been. You're right. I didn't really think about it. It would have been cool to have Brie eliminate her instead of the other way around. That probably would have been a better story, but it just seems to me like that whole segment was for that show that they have. So maybe it plays into whatever storyline they're doing there. I don't know. I don't really watch that.
Well, like you said, we don't have an hour and a half here, or else we could just book the entire territory. But
Sure.
If you want to catch up with any of Adam's work, be sure to visit onlygators.com. Also follow them on Twitter at onlygators. You can follow Adam on Twitter at Silverstein Adam, and find him on In This Corner podcast on CBS with Brian Campbell talking everything WWE and combat sports. You can also follow Only Gators on Facebook and Instagram at Only Gators. Adam, you're a busy man. You got a lot going on.
Yeah, there's only so many hours in the day, and I unfortunately use as many of them as I possibly can. Don't get much sleep.
Hey, I wish I was like you because I don't use all of mine the way I should.
Trust me, I wish I was like you. It's sometimes it can be too much work. You know, there's times in life where you got to slow down, and I'm trying to figure out when those can be.
Once again, check out Adam's work, onlygators.com, at onlygators on Twitter, and follow him on Twitter at Silverstein Adam. Adam, thanks for joining the show, talking Florida and a little bit of wrestling with me. I like to sprinkle it in here and then.
And some XFL. You forgot about that, but thank you.
XFL too, absolutely.
But thank you for having me. It was fun.
We probably should have just talked about the Royal Rumble the whole time. Like I said, we could have booked the territory up until WrestleMania, but that's all right because we had a great discussion about Florida football. So I want to thank Adam Silverstein for joining the show. Visit onlygators.com. Follow them on Twitter at onlygators, and follow Adam on Twitter at Silverstein Adam. When it comes to Florida next season, I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I like the long-term prospects of Dan Mullen there, especially after he figures out who he wants to start at quarterback, whether that's Emory Jones or somebody else. But I think in 2019, that's when you'll really see them take some strong steps forward, and there's no reason for them not to go back to a bowl game next season. I think the offense will be a little more dynamic. He'll be able to use those playmakers who have been inconsistent more than McElwain and his offensive staff did, and the defense is going to take a step up because Todd Grantham is one of the best defensive coordinators in the country, and when his defenses are at their best, as we saw with Mississippi State last year, they use that 3-4 to attack. You see some strong linebacker play, which Adam alluded to, Florida really needing to step up from a poor performance from their linebackers last year, but they have some players along the defensive line, and I think that Grantham is going to know how to use those guys. And Florida always has playmakers in the secondary. It seems like for the last 10 or so years, there's always been at least one guy who has first-round NFL draft pick written all over him, and I think that Marco Wilson is that guy, and he'll continue to improve off of what was a really good freshman season. So Florida has the pieces, but it may take a year or so for them to really put it all together and become a contender in the SEC. But I like what the vision of what Dan Mullen is doing, and I think that long term that's going to be a really strong play for them. And excited to watch Florida's spring game on the 14th and see what the initial results are and how that depth chart is shaking out. Once more, thanks to Adam for joining the show. Visit him on Twitter at Silverstein Adam, and go to onlygators.com and follow them on Twitter at onlygators. That's about it for today's show. I want to thank everybody who listened. If you like the show, please go to Apple Podcasts, search the Two Stripes Podcast, subscribe, leave a review, give me some feedback. You can also do that on Twitter. Send me a tweet at Dubsco. I am there. I'm always active on Twitter, and also go to soundcloud.com/twostripespod. Find this episode, all the old episodes, and search Colton Denning on YouTube if you're interested in any other of my college football work. I'll be back next week with another episode of the show, but until then, I want to thank you all for listening. My name is Colton Denning, and this is the Two Stripes Podcast.